Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear listeners. I hope that you're all well and I hope that you are enjoying your weekend so far and whatever's left of your weekend. In the next few videos, I've decided that I'm going to answer some of your questions. Now, because you're all such an engaged community, I get a lot of questions from you. And responding via comments is not always the most effective for me, and I can't delve into a lot of detail when I respond in comments. So I've decided that I will upload a video every few weeks where I answer your questions in a way that all other listeners can benefit too, because not everybody keeps tracks of comments. And also, there are lots of new subscribers to my channel, so they would also benefit from this format and this approach. Now, and I have seen a lot of new subscribers come in, more than 200 actually in the last few weeks, which is amazing. And I want to welcome them all. So welcome. And thank you so much for joining me in this learning journey. I always characterize my work as a journey. It is something in progress. And I think for as long as I live, my learning would just remain in progress because I'm one of those eternal students. I just love research, love learning, and love engaging in conversations about things that matter to me. And all of you that have now joined me, I believe that they matter to you as well. So it's a very joyful place for me to be in. So welcome. And just want to say as well that what you're joining here is kind of this discovery of an ethical and justice-oriented approach to Islam. And this is a space where we care about all humanity. This is not a space of hate and divisiveness and sectarianism. So I hope that you would really enjoy being part of this journey. And please do give me feedback on the work that I share with you. So the questions I'm covering today are mainly about modesty rules. So I had a cluster of questions around that, which I've grouped together. And I am finding, I have to say, your questions are getting more and more technical and analytical, which is actually making me really happy. And I'm really proud as well. I hope that I'm also contributing to some of your thinking and some of the formulation of your questions as well. So all I want to say is keep them coming, make them even more analytical. This is the kind of challenge I really enjoy. And it also forces me to do research as well, because sometimes you bring me perspectives that I've not thought about. And so I have to go back to my research, my resources, and then come back to you with an answer. So your amazing questions are helping me deepen my knowledge of Islam as well. So Jazakallah for that and keep them coming. So here we go. First set of related questions, and they're mostly about modesty and modesty rules and dress codes. There was a question from Silent Moments at Home. How strange it is that the Quran itself says it is in clear Arabic, meaning a Quran that everyone can understand. Yet, after so many centuries, women still haven't been able to figure out exactly how much they're supposed to cover and how much can remain uncovered. Every interpreter gives their own interpretation, and this is very depressing. A related question is from Yahya about the hidden adornments, which are mentioned in Surah Al-Noor in verse 31. And then another question related to modesty rules is from SurprisedBeach. That's a really nice, funny handle. From SurprisedBeach, who's asking whether women can show their neck or not. So I have grouped these questions together because I think the questions are related to each other, but the questions also give me an insight into how we often approach these topics. So my answer is not going to be prescriptive, which is something I'm sure you expect by now. It is not my job to tell you what to think or what to decide. The decision is always yours. But what I'm going to do is talk about two ideas, proportionality and balance, because I think once we keep those in mind as an approach, it will help us resolve some of these tensions that we experience and the dissonance and depression that many women experience, especially when they approach the modesty rules. So in terms of proportionality then, roughly 93% of the Quran is moral guidance through very powerful narrative. It's a very moving narrative. And it includes vivid imagery, but also lessons from the stories of earlier prophets. So there's always moral guidance in everything that the Quran says. So that's about 93% of the Quran. This is the vast bulk of the Quran. And then about 7% of the Quran is rules and regulations, including modesty rules for men and women. And generally, this is where scholars have landed. They say that about 500 to 600 verses are about rules and regulations. So about a tenth of the Quran, you might say, maximum, a tenth of the Quran is about rules and regulations. This proportionality gives us a clue. because Allah has decided this proportionality. So there's divine design behind that. So it gives us a clue as to where Allah is putting the emphasis. And it reminds us that we need to moderate our need to delve into extreme detail about rules and regulations. So when we delve into extreme detail and rules and regulations become the be all and end of the Quran, then we have messed with the proportionality of the Quran. We've made the Quran just a book about rules and regulations, like an instruction manual, which is what it is not. And neither should we turn to the two verses about modest dress codes and turn them into the central question. So we have to remember that there are only two verses which address all believers, which are about a code of conduct, what we call modesty, a code of conduct around modesty. And this is verse 30 and 31 in Surah Al-Noor, which is chapter 24 of the Quran. So we shouldn't turn these two verses into the central question in the Quran. They're not the central concern of the Quran. These verses fall within a long narrative about removing sexual indecencies, fahisha, from society. And Surah Nur particularly addresses the issue of zina, which is illicit or extramarital relationships between men and women. Because as you know, the Quran only allows sexual intimacy within the contract of marriage, within the bond of marriage. So for the Quran, morality and spiritual purification are the main theme. That's 90% of the Quran. And this sense of proportionality helps us as well in approaching the questions of rules and regulations. Otherwise, when the rules and regulations become the main question, especially the finer details in them, then we can experience anxiety and depression because we're giving ourselves a really difficult list of instructions to follow. And that can have a real impact on our daily lives and clearly on our mental well-being. And this is something that Iram and I have been covering in our podcast on religious OCD and the follow-up questions that we've taken from the audience, which I've recently released on my channel. So we're trying to kind of tease out what the causes of religious OCD are. And this is one of the causes, when that sense of proportionality becomes disturbed. Now, many female scholars, including me, have provided tons of evidence to show that Quranic rules and regulations were and still are primarily interpreted by men. And the interpretations are also male-centric. And women are often given a subordinate role in these interpretations. So we're assigned this role. Now, this subordination also extends to male entitlement in telling women what to wear. So women are told that God wants them to be submissive and shrouded. And this tells us, this framework of subordination that's been created, it tells us about the social circumstances and preferences of the interpreters themselves. It's the interpreter's mindset that we're seeing reflected in those views. And many of the interpreters who were writing in olden times, they lived in a very different society when social roles were very different. So I have explained at length that there is an interpretive mechanism at play in the case of women's dress codes. And I've covered this particularly in my video on the interpretive mechanism of the hijab, if you want to check that out. So when we read the Quran, it helps to clear our minds. And first and foremost, let the Quran speak for itself. In plain language, in plain English, Urdu, Punjabi, Pashto, French, whatever your language is that you can understand, first and foremost, just let the Quran speak for itself and let the Quran speak plainly. So just park all the interpretations to one side, okay? Let the Quran speak, then come back to interpretation. So you're in a position to judge and assess which interpretation feels closer to the Quran. Now, it helps when we read the Quran and let the Quran speak for itself, it helps to keep in mind, to accept, to uphold this idea that Allah is the most perfect of writers. And he is also the most perfectly self-aware author. Everything he tells us has hikmah or wisdom in it. So this self-awareness is important, okay? Because as a human being, my self-awareness would always be flawed. So I will have like a direction towards which I want to write, some thoughts and ideas I want to bring together. So I can never be perfectly self-aware in terms of how I'm writing. And when I write something as a mere human, a flawed human, I can contradict myself. There can be weaknesses in my argument. I can lose the coherence of my argument. I often can't keep track of my word count. I can be confused and unclear. Okay, this is the human experience of authorship, of writing something. And this is also why we critique human knowledge, okay? Because if we don't critique it, don't find flaws in it, we can't move forward. And this is something Muslims have lost. We often don't critique our scholars, whereas critique is a way of moving knowledge forward. But this is my authorship as a human being, right? Always flawed. And there is some limited self-awareness, some ability for self-awareness, but it's not perfect. So sometimes I can sit and struggle with the right choice of words, even though I have a really good vocabulary, but I can sit and think, oh my God, there is a word floating in my mind and I can't quite grasp it. Now, this is a human experience of authorship. But if you now compare it to God's authorship, and God's authorship is without flaw, because He is perfect. Allah is the most perfect and most perfectly self-aware and the best of authors. He knows exactly His choice of words. He knows exactly the grammar and the narrative style that He's going to use. He knows exactly how many words He's going to use and how to use them. He knows how to reach our hearts and minds. He knows exactly what to share with us in human language. He's chosen Arabic to share His teachings with us. And He's also told us there are things that He categorizes as knowable through rational reason and things which are unseen or ghaib, which are unknowable through rational reason or human language. So Allah is telling us all of that in the Quran. It's really beautiful the way the Quran makes things clear. And this is why when we say that the Quran is in clear language, it means that it's also making its meaning clear to us. And it reaches us as a really lovely, beautiful level of clarity. Now, we should keep in mind that God's commands, because remember, He's the perfect author, the perfect author, His commands are just as important as His silences. His silence is just as deliberate as His commands. Sometimes He uses words and sentences in a way that He gives a space to interpret and exercise choice. Now, in other words, Allah chooses not to prescribe or give us a recipe. Okay, He often does not give us huge, kind of refined, very prescriptive, itemized lists of things to do. And sometimes when He's giving a command, He can actually give the command in a way that some aspects of it are really explicit. And in other aspects, He's leaving to us to decide. Okay, this is all deliberate. This is God's plan. This is what He wants. He wants us to engage. And this is why perhaps He keeps saying to us repeatedly, come back and engage with the Quran, reflect on it, ponder on it. The Quran is for those who do fikr, intellectual engagement, those who have aql, who use rational reason. So He's giving us space. If God had given us every bit of knowledge that we ever needed, there would be no space for us to grow, to think, even to make decisions and exercise free will. Okay, so He gives us space to interpret and exercise choice. He has chosen, as I said, not to turn the Quran into an instruction manual. He's deliberately allowing movement. And I say deliberately again because purpose is part of divine design, divine creation. Allah tells us in Surah Al-Imran, this is the 3rd chapter of the Quran, in verse 191, He tells us that He has created everything in the heavens and the earth with purpose. So nothing's created in vain. Everything has a purpose. Even God's commands have a purpose, and His silence also has a purpose. Now, the modesty rulings also have a purpose. And there is a balance of prescription and non-prescription in those verses, okay? There is, again, hikmah behind that, which I'll explain to you in a second. So let's go back quickly to remind ourselves of what verse 31 in Surah Al-Noor says. This is the pivotal verse around women's dress code, and it addresses all believing women. Okay, so it applies to all Muslim women. I'm just going to read an excerpt from that. You're very familiar with the verse. And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what must ordinarily appear thereof, that they should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty except to their husbands, etc., etc., and that they should not strike their feet in order to draw attention to their hidden ornaments. And O you believers, turn you all together towards Allah, that you may attain bliss. So in this verse, the prescriptions, the clear rules are, I'm going to list those first. But just to say that even as I list them, just be mindful that we need to be quite nuanced about the understanding of those rules and not be literal about them. So, for example, the first prescription is lower the gaze. If we were to be literal about it, we would always just be staring at the ground. We intuitively know that is not what the Quran wants from us. The Quran wants us to look at men and women with respect in our gaze. Okay, so lowering the gaze is about not leering or not looking at somebody or staring at somebody in a sexual way. The next bit of prescription, very clear in the Quranic words, is guard the private parts. You can look at my hijab series where I talk about Surah Al-Noor in more detail and I explain why the Quran uses the word guard. What it means is not just to cover them, but to guard them. Guard them, why? How? By not committing zina, not committing sexual indecencies and not exposing those private parts. So it has both those meanings. Don't expose your private parts, and B, don't commit zina. The next prescription in those verses is do not display yourself in a way that it is inappropriate in context. Okay, let me repeat that. Do not display or adorn yourself in a way that it is inappropriate in context. Now, the phrase used is what must ordinarily appear thereof, whatever is norm or custom. So, for example, in ordinary daily life, women will dress very smartly for work, for study. But if a woman wears a formal wedding outfit and lots of jewelry, and then she goes to her university lecture, then she will turn heads. Why? Because even though her dress itself might be modest, it is inappropriate in the context. And that's what the Quran is saying. Be mindful of the context, what is ordinarily around you, what is part of your custom, your urf. Because the Quran does not want women to deliberately draw attention. Okay, tabarruj is the word used, where women deliberately draw attention, especially sexual attention. So do not display yourself in a way that is inappropriate in context. The next bit of prescription is cover your bosom or your chest and do not display the cleavage. This is the most clear-cut command in this verse in terms of kind of it actually gives you the exact mechanism. So it does give you prescription, it does give you process, okay? And it says, cover your chests, use your veils and cover your chests. But even here, the word used in Arabic is very subtle and dignified. Allah never uses crude words, okay? So the Quran never includes crude words. So the word used here is juyub. I have explained juyub before. It's the place where the breasts meet, okay? In this context of the verse. Juyub literally is the plural of jaib, or pocket. So it's where the two pockets meet. And this is the way Quran's way of saying it's the top of women's breasts. That's where the cleavage is. So it is explicitly said in Quranic verses that women should not display their cleavage. And the reason why the Quran uses such beautiful, subtle, and dignified words and terminologies, and the Prophet of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, also used to use very careful words, is because the Quran never objectifies women, and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam never objectifies women. So, in fact, when we come across hadith reports which do feel like they're objectifying women, that should send alarm bells going in our heads that we need to check the authenticity of that hadith, because the Prophet has never used demeaning and objectifying language towards women. And then the Quranic verse says, not strike the feet to draw attention to your hidden adornments. Now, Professor Khalid Abul Fadl, when he delves into the history of society at the time, he says that some Arab women used to wear these jangling anklets, or sometimes jangly necklaces, like they would make noise. And although they would be hidden behind the robes, if a woman was wearing a long robe, her necklace might be hidden or her anklets might be hidden as well. But when they walked in a certain way, then the noise would turn heads. So we're being told here that women can hide their jewels and their adornments behind their clothes, but they can still behave in a way that it can attract attention. And they want people in the public to know that they're here, so they're looked at. Okay, so the Quran is forbidding that. I also think, this is my view, that when women wear deliberately provocative dress, even if they're not wearing jewels or anything, so any dress that reveals their body shape quite explicitly, I feel that also is included in this section of the verse, but this is just my view. And finally, the verse actually tells us the rationale. The verse tells us why these commands are being given. So at the end of the verse, Allah addresses all believers. He says, men and women together turn to God, because by turning to God, you will find bliss. The word used in Arabic is tuflihun, which is related to the word falah, a salvation, which according to the Quran is only possible through inner purification or tazkiyah. So there's a very famous verse, again, you would all be familiar with it. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى. Falah is through tazakka. Falah is through doing tazkiyah, your inner spiritual purification. So here the Quran is telling us that abstaining from zina takes believers to falah. It's one of the ways of taking believers to falah. So zina is not just a sin involving a physical act, but it is also a spiritually corrupting act. I want to say very briefly here that this is how Islamic law is different from secular law. Secular law would say that as long as there are two consenting adults, that they're not being coerced into this situation of sexual intimacy. As long as they're consenting adults, it's fine for them to be sexually intimate. Because secular law does not take into account any concerns. It is not concerned with spiritual purification or tazkiyah, because it does not take human soul or the hereafter or accountability into account. Whereas Islamic law and Islamic rules and regulations are always moral legal. It's important to keep that in mind, that all laws in the Quran are moral legal. So there is always a moral question at stake. And so the law also tries to address those moral questions. So here the Quran is saying that zina is a spiritually corrupting act. And elsewhere in the Quran, actually, there are lots of verses about how Satan first tries to lead people astray. And one of the first things that Satan tries with us is to take us towards sexual indecencies or fahisha. There are various verses in the Quran around that. So you can now see how the narrative beautifully ties together the rules, the actual process to follow, the rationale for the rules, and the moral concern at the heart of these verses. But what we don't find in these verses is exhaustive, itemized detail. And there is hikmah in this as well. So now I'm going to come to the question of balance. Now, the problem emerges when this balance is disturbed. Again, I'll explain how that happens. So the problem emerges precisely because some scholars have chosen to prescribe and write an instruction manual for women in a space that God has left open to us, open for our interpretation, open for personal choice. Now, if we were to set aside all prescriptive interpretations and then read this verse, then the meaning is clear. So the Quranic language is clear. There is no ambiguity there. Surah Al-Noor is concerned with men and women acting in a dignified way and avoiding lewd behavior and zina. This is the point made in the first two verses of the surah as well. The second verse says, the first verse is about, I give you these commands. The second verse says, and if a man and a woman commit zina. So immediately, this is the concern of the surah or the chapter. And all the commands should then be seen within this overarching theme. So God is telling us to lower the gaze and guard our private parts. He's expressly forbidding the practice of exposing the cleavage. He's forbidding women to dress up or walk in a way to attract sexual attention in public. All else has been left open to us. And you might ask yourselves, why is that? Why has that space been left open to us? And the reason for that is the complexity of function and customs when it comes to dress. Okay, customs are diverse, functions are diverse. Now imagine we could do a counter experiment here. Imagine if Allah had indeed prescribed a dress code. Now, because Hijaz is a hot desert region where the Quran was revealed, it is very reasonable to assume that the prescription would include loose clothing, probably made from some natural fiber like linen or cotton to let air currents cool the body. Okay, because dress code there would have the function of also being able to cool the body. Now, if the Quran was only for the Arabs of Hijaz, and this is important to understand, that if the Quran was only for the Arabs of Hijaz, then this would make sense, because the Quran is then talking to a particular society living in a particular geography, and geography matters when it comes to dress. But the Quran tells us that it is hudal nas. So it is guidance for all human beings. Should the Quran have then included maybe separate chapters or instructions for people living in the frozen Arctic Circle who can't really wear loose cotton clothes because they'll freeze to death? What about humid and tropical Southeast Asia where you sweat a lot and dehydrate? Or the very damp and rainy cold that we get in England, which requires different forms of dress? So, what would people here in the UK or those living in the Arctic Circle do with a prescription if the prescription said wear loose cotton robes? Now, some people wear animal fur, which is bound tightly around their bodies to minimize loss of body heat. This happens a lot in communities in Alaska, in the Arctic Circle. In these cold countries, we often wear snug clothes to keep warm. We don't wear loose clothes. We wear snug clothes. The snugness of the garment, because it's close to the body, it retains more heat. Now imagine if somebody wore a jubba all the time, even in the middle of winter in Britain, or when we get the very blustery autumn, your jubba would become a parachute, literally, in gale force winds. You're just going to be swept off your feet. And this happens, I've seen this happen to people here who've literally actually toppled over because of the force of the wind. And if you then wear long robes, they're going to drag on pavements with really slippery, squelchy leaves in the autumn, and you will go home with mud all over your clothes. So then that would create an issue around washing your clothes all the time and how much resource you use to do that. And so in countries like this, jeans and tights just make life so much easier, which is why people wear those clothes here. And in the summer, or mostly here, women would wear long skirts and long dresses because actually in the summer, people do wear the long, loose fitting clothes to let air circulate around your body. So even through seasons, our clothing changes. And then there is cultural expression. Now, if the Quran prescribed, and remember, if Allah prescribes, you have no choice. So if Allah had prescribed for us an austere black robe, then we would have to wear the austere black robe. We would have no choice because that would be God's command. But He hasn't given us that command. Why hasn't He given us that command? Because He knows that we will feel trapped and sad and joyless in a monochrome existence. And this has happened to Muslim women in front of our eyes over the last 30 or 40 years. Because Allah knows that we have a preference for color, we have a preference for patterns. We know that color and pattern are so tied to our kind of personalities, and it brings us joy, it brings vitality into our lives. So Allah chooses not to prescribe. He doesn't give us a color. I mean, people often talk about the length of the garment or how many inches of skin should show or not show. But what about the question of color? Because these verses could have been extended further, and we could have been told you can only wear white, gray, and black and nothing else. And then the function of dress. Now, if the Quran prescribed a jubba for men, a long robe for men, how will they manage things like working as paramedics, where you're driving in an ambulance, hurtling down the road, and then you have to rush to casualties? You have medical gear strapped on your body, you have radios that you need to use. Even builders here who wear cargo trousers and they have to wear tool belts. And there are women here who are engaged in these jobs as paramedics and builders, and they wear the same clothes. Why? Because those clothes have a function. And female nurses in hospitals and doctors in hospitals, surgeons, they often wear half-sleeved clothes. And the reason for that is hygiene. It's not to expose the body, but to be hygienic, because you have to scrub and disinfect all the way up to your elbows. And they often wear these loose baggy trousers for ease of movement because they have to spend long days standing on their feet because they have these long shifts in the hospital. So what I'm trying to say is that by not prescribing, the Quran is balancing so much, so beautifully. So we start from the question of proportionality to begin with, and now we're addressing this question of balance. And look at everything the Quran is balancing through these verses. It is balancing the functional, the aesthetic, the spiritual, the social, the cultural. It is balancing all of that. It is balancing the human kind of fitra, our sense of self, who we are. Crucially, the Quran gives no hukum. There is no morality or moral question attached to the head covering. Why? Because the head covering is political. Fundamentally, it has been political for millennia. And for millennia, it has been used to divide women and condemn their character. So the Quran could have said, wearing the khimar is also moral and it will take you to falah. But it does not say that. What it says is that covering your bosom is important to keep away from sexual indecencies. So when we prescribe or when our scholars prescribe where God has not prescribed, we create imbalances and hardships, and this leads to internal dissonance and anxiety. I get very annoyed with male scholars. In Pakistan, this happens a lot. They're telling women to wear gloves and socks in deadly heat, so the bodies can't breathe properly. It is horrendous. And they should be ashamed of themselves for creating hardships like that and for obsessing about and fetishizing women's bodies. So the Quran is not an instruction manual, and it is reductive to think about it this way, okay? Another example illustrates this point that the Quran does not give us the definition of alcohol. It mentions intoxicants instead as a general category. So, which means that alcohol that does not intoxicate is perfectly fine to use. Now, I've heard Muslims talk about alcohol-free stuff and obsess about this, okay? Why? Alcohol is an essential solvent. It is used extensively in medicines and skincare and cleaning products and foods. You know, vinegar is a type of alcohol. Even intoxicating alcohol has different concentrations of alcohol in it. So, whiskey and vodka, I now know, having lived in Britain for a period of time, whiskey and vodka have much higher alcohol concentration percentages compared to beer and ale. So should we now ask Allah for a manual with alcohol concentration percentages so we can practice Islam? Or should we focus instead on the hikmah of his guidance, which is quite simple? Do not intoxicate yourself because that can result in harmful behavior. And the Quran explains what that is. So similarly, rather than demanding how many inches of skin women can show above the collarbone or the wrist, you know, can they leave their forearms exposed? Can they leave their elbows exposed? Can they leave their necks exposed? How about we consider as a broader question, what type of dress and behavior takes people close to zina? But that is the main concern of the Quran, and I believe that that is where our focus should be. And it is always worth remembering that the hikmah of these fairly flexible rules is to put a stop to sexual indecencies. It is to enable us men and women to interact with each other in really dignified and decent ways. So rather than sexualizing each other or looking at each other with a sexual gaze, that we look at each other with respect. I mean, this is such a beautiful command in the Quran, but it's just been reduced to these discussions about women's hands and their feet and their hair. We can see just how much hikmah is encapsulated in these two verses. So really the question that I think we need to ask ourselves is this: why do I have the need for a prescriptive set of rules and regulations in a religious matter where Allah has chosen not to prescribe? And it is a very important question to ask, because once we have answered that question, I think it would really empower us. And we would also learn to turn away from those ulama who are stepping into that space of prescription when they should not be stepping into that space of prescription. Why? Because Allah has chosen not to prescribe. Now then, I hope that this kind of longish discussion, which was around philosophical approaches and methodology, I hope you found that useful. In the next video, inshallah, which will come out next week, I'm going to pick up another excellent question, which is from Ivana Schneider. And it's about the claim that the earliest tafsir books were the best ones and the later tafsir books are not as good. So there's a question about historical proximity to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the earliest Muslim community. It's a fascinating question, but there's a lot to unpack in that. Inshallah, in the next video, I'm going to pick that up. So I hope that you found this discussion useful and it gave you new ways of thinking about the modesty rulings in the Quran. If you are benefiting from my research and if benefiting from this channel, please like my channel, subscribe to it, share my channel. I am building this amazing community of Muslims. Absolutely love being part of this community and part of your discussions. My subscriber base is now really growing and I'm really pleased with that. It's taken about 2 years to get to this point. So you can help me out here and help my channel grow further. I also have a lovely new website, sitaraakram.com. I will put a link in the description. I am offering structured courses there, and the first one I have created is about understanding the types of knowledge and the sources of knowledge of Islam, and it particularly looks into the differences between Hadith and Sunnah, which is really important in understanding how religious knowledge is created, because often hadith reports are used to create Sharia rulings for us. And in that course, I explain why that is not appropriate and how scholars across millennia have questioned that approach. It's a really academically rigorous course, but it is delivered in a really accessible way and has lots of examples, real life examples in there to help aid your understanding, and lots of resources if you want to do further learning in your own time. So please sign up to my website, and my course says sign up to the newsletter. The newsletter function will be ready soon, so I will be able to tell you every time a new course is released or a new blog is released. And by doing that, by signing up, you can support my work. My course catalog will build gradually, inshallah, so there will be more coming your way, including free courses as well. And lastly, please remember me in your prayers. Thank you very much, as ever, for listening to me. Assalamu alaikum.